was a really impressive hush. It just fell over us. I guess that means we should start. So welcome to the ethics panel. I'm Michael Bennett, and my responsibility is moderation today. A part of that has to do with introductions. The introductions that I give will be really brief, though, because this is a very sophisticated panel, and they've insisted on introducing themselves. So they'll each take 3 to 5 minutes to tell you how exactly their work relates to regulatory issues related to nano R&D. And then I'll present to the panel generally 2 or 3 questions, depending on how long we take to respond to them, and they take to respond to them. And then it'd be great if you, the audience, could present us as a panel questions that you'd like to hear us respond to. So to my immediate right here is Ronald Sandler. He's a philosopher here at Northeastern, and he's doing research with the Nanotechnology and Society Research Group here. Next to him is Mark Sanner. He's the executive director at the Regulatory Governance Initiative. Next to him is Makan Mbeng, who is based at the University of Geneva School of Law. And then at the end of the table is Mark Hunyadi, who is a philosopher and is based at the Catholic University Louvain. And then I think at the very end of the table is a really nice person who's going to help us speak clearly to you and maybe do a little translation on the fly. And maybe dance as well, right? Cheers, cheers. Cheers. So the first question that I'd like to pose to the panel generally is, it'd be great to hear each of you, or any of you who cares to speak to this, say a bit about how you understand the potential for ethics or ethical analysis to be applied to the domain of either regulatory issues concerning nano R&D or nano R&D generally. What role does ethical analysis have to play in either of these domains, or both?
I can say something. Yeah, one of the issues that came up a fair bit yesterday was to what extent nanotechnology poses unique issues in regulation and in other domains, and that's also, of course, a good question. To what extent are there any really unique ethics issues in nanotechnology? So what I would like to say to that is that ethics is such a pervasive discipline that you do have, in most activities, you have an array of ethics issues. If they're unique or not is a good question. I do believe there are very few, or maybe none, that are truly unique to nanotech. But that doesn't mean that ethics is not a pervasive topic. When judgments are made, for example, on resource allocation, distribution, you could come up with a catalog which is very long on ethics issues that can come up in nanotechnology. So it's certainly present. On the role of ethicists, I would say that that's actually a different issue. What ethicists can do on nanotechnology, I don't see it so much as a specialized profession that comes in, like perhaps a lawyer who will fix or draft certain texts. I see it more as a broad spectrum analytic service. So I do see there is a value in, for example, playing the semantics police, if you want, or try to come up with a broader perspective, or to ask questions which are otherwise not asked. So that's just a few thoughts on what ethics is in nanotechnology and the role of ethicists.
Yeah, thank you. So just maybe to come back on the frame of what we may understand through the notion of ethics, or what are ethical considerations in the international framework, because I speak from the international law perspective. There has been some very interesting studies recently and mostly done by the WHO on how to incorporate ethical considerations in the prevention or management of pandemic influenza. And what I found interesting is the evolution in what can be considered as ethical consideration. First of all, we find some traditional components or elements, like for instance, balancing interests, rights, and values. And how do you balance interests, rights, and values in terms of ethical deliberation is that you base your ethical deliberations on a human rights framework. So this is what the WHO came with. Then second component, which is also rather traditional, it's that component which relates to transparency, public engagement, and social mobilization. So that is a second component of ethical considerations. Then a third one, it's what we call information, education, and communication as ethical considerations that have to be taken into account in environmental management or health prevention. But then what I found interesting in that WHO report is a new, and you will correct me maybe, but a new aspect of ethical consideration. It's to say that policymakers must or should base their decisions on the best available evidence, evidence available at any time. So this seems to me interesting and peculiar in the sense that most of the time we consider that there is a sort of clash between ethics and science, sound science, ethics. But it's interesting to see that there is an evolution in the ethics debate consisting in incorporating sound science-based decision in ethical considerations. So this is maybe, I don't know, Mark, if you want to say something about it, but I think this is quite an evolution.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to say is that ethics is not a brake on progress. I think in this case, in this field, ethics is a tool for reflexivity. I mean, ethics has not to, in this case, ethics has not to say if nanotechnologies are good or wrong, because nobody knows it. Nobody knows if it's good or wrong, and even the scientists don't know if it's good to create a world of particles, nanoparticles. The promises the scientists make are very seductive, or maybe good, but who can really tell if that it won't go wrong? So, as a speaker, he's not here. As a speaker said yesterday, why not take time to do it right? And this is reflexivity, the capacity to change or to modify the rules of the game before it's too late. And it's important to say that the simple fact that new technology involves risks, this simple fact is not an ethical problem. This is a technical, scientific problem, but it's not an ethical problem. The real ethical problem arises when they try to minimize, to trivialize the risks or to hide the risks. So it's a problem of communication, problem of communication of risks. That's the real problem. Not to say to the people how uncertain science is or research is, and so on. This is the ethical problem. And for instance, yesterday I was really surprised. We had this speaker, Ahmed Busnaini, who said at the end of his conference, he said, well, we know very little about these particles. But he knew very quickly that they're safe. So I see there a real contradiction, and this is a real communicational problem.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. So I'm, as Michael said, I'm with the Nanotechnology Society group here at Northeastern, and I spend quite a lot of time working with folks in public policy, political science, and engineering. What does somebody with an environmental ethics and environmental values and technology background do there? Well, I mean, I think what's possible for any public policy is to run a values analysis on the public policy, just like you do an economic analysis or a risk analysis or legal analysis, right? You can try to identify the various values dimensions involved in public policy, and you can try to project based on knowledge of past technologies, based on knowledge of the social context in which things are going on, based on structures that are in place, how the particular public policy is going to affect those values. So this is what I do, right? So you take a public policy and you say, all right, why is this good? Why is the objective of this policy good? Why is it beneficial? What are the risks, obviously? What are the benefits? How are they distributed? You can evaluate it with just uncontroversial principles of justice, like treating like cases alike, common good principles, mobility principles, equity principles. You can analyze it from an individual rights perspective, from an autonomy perspective, informed consent perspective. So I think there's actually quite a robust role for, I don't so much call it ethics as values analysis at the time that public policy formation is going on, because if you want to be able to evaluate competing public policy options, I think you would want to know all those dimensions I just mentioned, those values dimensions, as much as you'd want to know the economic and risk dimensions as well. Now, I was actually sitting up there thinking a bit earlier, it might be a lot harder to do that, or it would be a step up in meta level to try to do that for governance structures. It seems trickier to do that rather than particular public policies. But I would throw that out there to this audience, not knowing in any way whether that's true.
Do you want me to want us to follow up?
Please, please.
Yeah, I want to agree with this point that a value analysis of a policy is absolutely possible. And I have in Canada, when I worked as a consultant, I have discussed this with policymakers to some extent. There's a formal process of policymaking in Canada. So would you like, for example, to be valuing creating an explicit ethics screen in policymaking, which could be testing for universality and so forth? What's interesting is two things come out. One is the policymakers who do not necessarily have an ethics background or claim to be ethicists, they basically say, we already do that. Of course we do that. We check for the law, we check if the human rights are violated, we check for universality, for justice, etc. So one hurdle is to convince the existing system that they are doing a substandard job when it comes to doing ethics without calling it ethics. The second issue is the connotation ethics has. And again, as a consultant, I've tried this out. Go into a boardroom with a group of people and say, we have an ethics issue. The moment you say that, people get very worried, because an ethics issue is a problem, a big problem. It sounds like some kind of a major violation. So, and actually also in support of what you said, the solution sometimes is to use the word values, which is less problematic. But then you can also equally justify the use of the word simply legal, just, fair. And I believe every policymaker in the world would claim that when they do their work, they're looking for fairness. It doesn't require specialized expertise of any sort.
I don't know if the word is so problematic anyway. I know that in international practice, in some international organizations dealing with core environmental or health risks, you have some sort of institutionalization of ethics. If you go at the level of the Food and Agriculture Organization, you have some panel of experts in ethics with respect to food safety which have been established there and which are issuing ethics reports. You have what we call the FAO ethics series, so that you have that sort of institutionalization. Even at the level of the World Health Organization, you have a department on ethics, equity, trade, and human rights. So you have that, how do you call that, integration of ethics, equity, trade, and human rights. So I don't know. I think that within the framework of those organizations dealing with environmental risks, like those risks which may be posed by nanotechnologies, there is a real discussion on ethics, and there is also a discourse on ethics. But then you write that depending on the fora, you may have some others, other hats to refer to the ethics. I'm thinking, for instance, about the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact. For me, this is exactly the example of an instrument dealing with ethics, because you know that it's all these 10 principles for businesses, and you have 3 main principles for dealing with environmental protection. And the very purpose, the very objective of the UN Global Compact is to have business associations, the civil society subscribing to those principles, and then having the label of, oh yes, you are Global Compact friendly. And this is interesting to see that they wouldn't use in that context the word ethics or values. They would go into a more formal or traditional legal perspective through the reference of to principles. But the idea of ethics is still behind, I think, somewhere.
Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, from an ethical point of view, I think we have to expand the value analysis far more. I mean, we have to expand it to the project as a whole, the nanotechnological project as a whole. I think the main ethical issue is it's not a communicational one, which is also very important, or risk communication. But the main issue is related to the project as a whole, as illustrated by the NBIC convergence project. This is a metaphysical project. This metaphysical project underpins the whole discourse about nanotechnologies, and the whole discourse, the promises, what are made, and so rest on fundamentally metaphysical proposition and shape a new image of human being. And that must be discussed. I mean, we can't just accept that as a fait accompli, we say in French. There we must put some reflexivity in it. I mean, we can't let industries shape our identity. I mean, it's not fair. It's not acceptable. So we have to reflect on it. There are many metaphysical assumptions lying under this discourse. For instance, the assumption that nature is like a machine, and I mean the materialistic assumption. I have a few notes. Sorry if I read them a little because my English. So the materialistic assumption that human condition can be significantly improved by improving or enhancing our biological capacities, or the artificialist conviction that the ultimate constituents of matter can be transformed in machines able to accomplish some specific functions, and so on. There are many. So none of these assumptions are unquestionable. And they will shape, these assumptions will shape our identity. So don't let the industry do that.
I think
without reflection, I mean. Without reflection, because I can't say it's good or not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we must do it with reflection. We must know what we're doing.
I think Ron is going to close out this question with one more comment.
Well, I think this panel has demonstrated the point that if you put 4 ethicists together and give them one question and 4 microphones, we can fill any amount of time.
Spoken sequence.
So back to the idea of the value analysis, I wanted to pick up on a few things that was said. I mean, the idea here, and this maybe has to do with the notion of the using of ethics. So the concept of ethics often is that you do ethics and you get to some decision, and it's a thou shall or thou shall not decision at the end, right? The idea here is that it's not that the value analysis results in a decision. It generates relevant information for making decisions in the way that a life cycle analysis would, right? So a life cycle analysis would tell you, here's the ecological impacts of all the different parts of the production process, and here's some economic trade-offs if you want to do it a different way. Similarly here with values, you want to have all the information available so you can see where the trade-offs are, and you want to try to refine the policy so that you can maximize the values at stake. So that's one idea of not, sort of making a judgment at the end of the analysis. The second thing I wanted to mention was, if we want to run an analysis of nano, I really wonder how valuable a value analysis of nano as such would be. So I agree that NBIC technologies, nano, bio, info, cogno technologies that would enhance human capacities beyond whatever, raise a lot of important metaphysical and ethical issues about human nature and how we should regard human nature and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that carbon nanotubes and computer chips do. And so it seems to me that if you're going to run a values analysis or an ethical analysis of nano, you're going to have to do it with particular technologies and particular fields and particular applications, because the fact that something's nano, that it makes use of nanoscale science and engineering, tells you almost nothing about the benefits, the costs, the control, the effects it'll have on autonomy, justice, what the distribution of those benefits are, or if it raises privacy issues or human rights issues and so on. So it seems, so my view on this at least, is that when you're doing ethics and values analysis, rather than spreading it out to think about nano as such, you focus it in on particular fields, research programs, and types of applications.
Yesterday, on at least 3 occasions, during my attendance at least, at the multiple panel discussions, the term humanity was tossed about, and it oftentimes sounded like it was fronted with a capital H. So humanity will receive any number of benefits from quantum dot technology. Humanity will benefit from the distribution of nano-enabled materials or the production of any number of types of nanoparticles. I wonder if we can bend some of the sentiments that have been expressed already about metaphysical considerations and the construction of identity based on the various types of semantic choices made by stakeholders in these discussions. I wonder if we could bend some of that back in to say something about how we might begin to consider socioeconomic issues when we think about policy making in the context of nano R&D and regulation in particular. Class, race, gender, are these matters that we should be thinking about as policymakers? And if so, how should they be imagined? How should we bring our ethical analysis to bear on these problems, considering them?
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah, I mean, if you sit down with engineers and you talk about justice and nanotechnology, they're like, what? I'm in a lab and I got these particles and I'm trying to figure out what they're doing. And I'm trying to figure out how I can make them do that. And you want to talk to me about social justice? I'm doing the same thing I've been doing for the last 30 years. I'm just doing it better. And so what's the justice issues? And this goes back to the context, right? So if you ask the question, what's the novel social or ethical issue raised by nano? The answer might be very little, or it might be that it raises some interesting philosophical issues around reductive control of matter. But if you ask that question, you're going to miss almost all of the ethical issues, because almost all of the ethical issues, I think, come out of the intersection of a powerful new technological platform with existing issues and questions and problems in society. So when we take a technology and we move it into society, and we have a society that has class, gender, race issues, the question is, what's that technology's implications for those issues? Is it going to perpetuate problems? Is it going to help alleviate problems? Is it going to exacerbate problems? So here we do work on nano-manufacturing here at Northeastern. And if you think about nano-manufacturing from an environmental justice perspective, environmental justice has to do with the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, and there's a lot of evidence in the United States that the negative, the cost associated with manufacturing falls more heavily on low incomes and high minority communities, right? So if you're going to cite a whole bunch of new manufacturing facilities, nano-manufacturing facilities, and you're going to have a whole lot of old manufacturing facilities coming offline that are going to need to be cleaned up, and you're in a society where traditionally, though this is getting much better in recent years, cleanups in high minority and low-income communities have been slower and less thorough, and siting of these manufacturing facilities happens disproportionately in those communities, so they're exposed to the hazards. Then nano-manufacturing, if you're bringing on a lot of new facilities and getting rid of old ones, might exacerbate the problem. And it has almost nothing to do with the nature of nanoparticles, right? It just has to do with the context in which they're emerging. So I think I don't know what that means for somebody working in the lab, but certainly from the public policy perspective, it seems if we want responsible development of nanotechnology, we'd have to think not just about science and technology policy, but the broader public policies around environment, environmental justice, and so on that impact the way in which the technologies emerge and permeate through society.
Okay, well, I agree with this view. Something which could be gained is by using the example of nanotech or any other emerging technology to just really show how much embedded values or ethics judgments there are in existing systems and the systems that are being built, like new innovation packages that are being handed out. It's in some ways there's more to be gained by showing how pervasive ethics is, and that precisely the main issue is not the new, so apparent new issues. The main issue is the existing, because there has been little time has been spent on, for example, in regulation, on teasing out what embedded values there are. So, for example, this morning we saw by Jeff Morris, EPA, one slide was on the roster of tests on the endpoints in regulation. Now, when endpoints are being debated, it's really a negotiation. It's a question of cost of these tests and preferences of countries and the existing protocols and so on. But of course, it matters a great deal what you test, if you want, in terms of what you know afterwards, if you really want to make decisions based on knowledge and science. So, for example, one may test the toxicity to a bird, but one may not test it to a snake, because, people like birds, or because of Silent Spring, or 100 reasons. I'm not saying it's a bad decision, but someone made that decision, that you, out of between 1 and 10 million species, you choose 20, and these will be the ones you build your whole judgment of environmental risk on. There are a myriad of issues like that, balancing between type 1, type 2 errors in statistics, the very poor statistics that are possible in bioassays, that's a judgment too, that we use so few replicates because it's cheaper. So the system is full of judgments, and they have to do with the ethical framework, they have to do with justice, what do you want to protect, who do you count, do you base everything on the body weight of a child or an adult, and so forth. So I would say that will be a value for when ethicists get an opportunity to speak, because there is new interest, new money around, and no time to be spent. I would be in favor of linking the current file to the broader system overall. And like Pat Mooney said yesterday, to really seriously think about talking about emerging technologies as a whole, which I think Mark also would advocate, the convergence and so on, and bring the broader picture to the table. I think that's a value.
Okay, what are socio-economic considerations? I mean, you've been referring to gender issues, I think reducing the gap between the poor and the rich, issues like that. At the level of international practice, there has been already, I mean, there is still a big controversy about socioeconomic considerations, because I think some of you here know that in the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, you have a provision. So the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety deals with the trade in living modified organisms. So you have a provision in that protocol, Article 26, which allows states to take into consideration socioeconomic considerations in risk analysis or in their decisions regarding the import of living modified organisms. So of course this was mainly a provision which was put in the body of the protocol by developing countries, not really by developed countries. So it seems that the discussion surrounding socioeconomic consideration is mostly something which reflects a concern of developing countries than developed countries. So now, to bring it in the context of nanotechnologies, the question we should ask ourselves is how do we incorporate socioeconomic considerations in the debate relating to nanotechnologies? And my position in that regard is that, of course, those socioeconomic considerations have to be taken into duly taken into account at all the levels of risk analysis. So, at the level of risk assessment, even if you told us that in the context of a lab, socioeconomic consideration wouldn't really play a role, but I think that a real incorporation of socioeconomic considerations means that they are taken into account at the level of risk assessment, at the level of risk management, and at the level of risk communication. Then, of course, you would tell me, oh, this is pure theory. I admit it, but practically, it implies a different process in the identification of risks related to dangerous substances or new technologies. And one of that implication would be broader public participation already at the stage of decision. How do you call that? At the stage of the conception of decisions related to those new technologies. Maybe new systems of labeling. I don't know. In terms of risk communication, would you? I don't know. Would you put in a label system a reference to the fact that, okay, this nano product takes into account, I don't know, gender issues, or I don't know. So, but I think that from the preliminary step would be to recognize that we need to have those socioeconomic considerations at all levels: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. And this is also something which is, in a way, being promoted by some standardization bodies like the Codex Alimentarius in their rules dealing with risk analysis. They have the necessity of taking into consideration other legitimate factors. So it's not only the pure science or the risk as analyzed in a lab, but also some other legitimate factors, and I think socioeconomic considerations could be put in that basket.
Well, I agree with McCann, but the problem is that at each level of these analyses, it's very difficult to identify the actors who have interest to tell the truth. It's a big problem. So maybe the lay people can play an important role here, not the experts, but the lay people. So this would be a plea for a deliberative model of discussion, negotiation. Sure.
Do you imagine, panelists, that they're useful lessons flowing from the ethical debates, the ethical analysis that we saw unfolding in the context of the GM discussion and the development of biotechnology generally? Do you imagine that they're useful lessons and analogies to be drawn from that period, useful for nano analysis, obviously?
Well, I would say the answer is yes, although the files are completely different. But when you look at the whole spectrum from innovation, the allocation of resources, all the way to the launch of products into the market, or perhaps taking products off the market, there are some lessons to be learned for sure. And questions have been asked in, for example, the context of genetic engineering. Why is so much money spent on this technology instead of another technology? That question you can always ask. That's a good question. The labeling issue, the question of deliberation. When you bring something to the market, which some people would argue is not that novel, but it appears novel to people out there for whatever reason, that causes certain issues. So I would say yes, there are, but I wouldn't take from that yes the implication that the files are similar. I see them as very dissimilar.
Certainly traditionally, the analogies played a strong role in motivating social and ethical research on nano, right? The idea here is that from many people's perspectives, something went wrong with genetically modified foods and organisms, and it was costly economically, socially perhaps. And so what went wrong was that the public wasn't consulted, these things showed up out of nowhere, the public didn't understand them, and then there was this opposition to that. And so we need to try to avoid that for nano, called avoiding the backlash. I actually think that and that's been very powerful in motivating the social and ethical discourse within the NNI, especially, I think. I actually think that analogy is quite unhelpful, because I think I agree with Mark here that there is an enormous disanalogy between GM and nano, and it's that nano is so much broader than GM. So earlier the discussion came up about food and agriculture. Right, so there you probably get a lot of good inferences, things to learn from GM for nano, because if you have nano agricultural products, it's going to intersect with all those issues in agriculture that we see again and again. There's cultural issues, there's the fact that you consume the food, it goes inside your body, there's tradition issues, there's naturalness concerns, but all of that stuff, all of those concerns do not apply to medical technologies. And nano's in medical technologies just as much as it's in ag. So I don't think there should be a concern about public resistance to nanotechnology as such. Maybe with certain types of nanotechnologies, like food nanotechnology, maybe human enhancement-based nanotechnology-based human enhancements, maybe things that would be weapons and military applications and so on. But I think there's a pretty big dissimilarity, and that has to do with the scope of the technologies that makes it such that you wouldn't want to draw lessons from GM for nano as such.
Something quickly. One of the reasons why genetic engineering became such an issue is this whole view of Pandora's box, that once it's out, it's out. It's very persistent, people believe, which goes together with playing God idea. And I just want to alert to this, an old portion of the nanofile. When Bill Joy wrote in Wired magazine that the three technologies that are truly dangerous are biotech, nanotech, and I think robotics. He really alerted to that issue. He said, once you create something which becomes either infinitely persistent or quasi-infinitely persistent, or worse, it actually grows in a quantity out there, you have a complete different class of risk. Because it's very difficult to recall once it's on the market. So I would say that one issue that has also to do with transhumanism, the engineering of the human germline, once a technology enters, it's not so much it's nano, GM, or whatever it is, but once, in terms of risk category, it goes into the class of persistent products, it's in a new category. And if it's more than persistent, if it's self-reproducing, then it's yet another category of risk. And that's actually very rational to categorize things according to risk in this way as opposed to the name we give to the product.
Yes, I see an analogy with the GMs in the strategy of argumentation, namely the trivialization of these technologies. To say, yes, it's just the same as before, but better, as you said. I don't agree with that. It was very clear with the problem of cloning. The defenders of cloning said, well, it's a reproductive device like any other artificial reproductive device. It's simply not true. Cloning, in difference with the others, is the first device where you don't respect the genetic lottery. Okay, so you can say, I don't want a child, I want this child. Okay, it's very different. So I don't say if it's good or not, but it's different. Okay, and we have to reflect on that. So we have to avoid these strategies of reduction.
So feel free to lift your hush now and present the panel with any questions that are formed in your percolating minds.
I'm Brooke Baker from Northeastern. A very large percentage of the conference has been focused on risk and the management of that risk through regulation. And your discussion has been, a refreshing move to some extent, but still largely on the risk side in some ways in terms of the discussion that's been had. But of course, there's the benefit side. I don't know much about the benefits of nano, but certainly to the extent I pay attention to its potential medical uses, I think they could be quite significant. And we haven't had much discussion about the regulation of access. Now, to some extent, that's a set of background rules and background assumptions, but one of the advantages of new technologies is to begin again to have the discussion of what are the access principles that are going to apply. So, for example, much of the breakthrough research at present on nano is being done in universities, funded by public tax dollars. And yet we persist in a system where the technology transfer is basically done on purely commercial basis with, in many institutions, very little consideration of access provisions for developing countries, for poor people more generally, to the benefits of that technology. We don't do a whole lot questioning some of the background intellectual property rules which basically create monopoly control over the terms of access. And so I wonder whether part of our discussion about the regulation of nano shouldn't address these downstream access to the benefits. So, one human right is to the benefit of access to scientific knowledge and breakthrough. We're as a species entitled to that. We're entitled to better food. We're entitled to better health. We're entitled to sanitation and clean water. And so I just wonder if there's a way to bring more of that discussion to the fore, because again, this is an opportunity to do it. Because the background rules don't, basically go unchallenged, but new technologies may give us a chance to bring those to the fore again.
I'll always go. It's a good point. So suppose you want to develop a particular nanomedical technology so that it would benefit those who are worst off, right, globally. Where do you try to intervene there? And I think that the interesting thing is you can intervene at loads of steps, right? You can actually intervene at the engineering stage and say, let's design these things so that they can be useful under the kinds of conditions that they would need to be useful under with the kind of expertise in that place so that it could have a significant public health impact. And we saw something like that with the $100 laptop project, right? where they were trying to really design these machines so that they would be useful in particular contexts that were very different than the kind of context that computers are usually designed for. So that's there. How do you promote that, right? What's interesting is that often that gets promoted by private groups. There it was, it was Negroponte and his group. A lot of the best work in medicine to help global poor is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is funding that stuff. So maybe there's a way to put incentive structures into place that would encourage people designing the technology to try to design it in a way that it would help the global poor. And there's people who are working on that. I don't know if people know the work of Thomas Pogge, but he's proposing developing an international mechanism where there would be a fund that would pay people who invent technologies or medicines or companies that did so on the basis of their global health impact. So the bigger the impact on improving global health, the bigger the payment is. It would be a different kind of patent structure, for example. So there you see, I'm going on with this example a little bit, there you see the intersection of the design principles and the public policies that would have to both be put into place to try to get that outcome. And almost none of it has to do with nanoness, in a way, right? Which is the social context point from earlier.
Could I just offer a comment to Professor Baker's remark? I mean, we have different disciplines. This is a multidisciplinary event, and it's a very, again, as I said earlier, a very, very terrific event. But the discipline that studies different modes of transfer is in fact economics, and I haven't seen much economic research on these issues as of yet. But it sort of suggests that another time. Economic analysis and considerations of modes of delivery, aid versus the marketplace, and if so, what kind of marketplace would be interesting considerations. So I just want to offer that as a suggestion to complete the space of analysis, if you want, and where some analytics could be introduced that, and again, I don't know with Professor Sandler what your background, your public policy, so you do a lot of economics, but that may be a missing element in this conversation. So I agree with you entirely.
I balance my checkbook.
Most economists don't.
Should be on the panel.
Yeah, could I maybe just a quick point of support about the access issue. I do believe it's an opportunity to talk about intellectual property in particular, but also access, for example, distribution of technology across the world, the haves and have-nots of access to technology. But in practical terms, in Canada, the Patent Act is 100 years old. It has, of course, been amended, but there is every so and so often people say we really have to start from scratch and write a new Patent Act. And the people who are very much actually against that idea are the ones who are worried that the current structure of business, the power of multinational corporation is such that if you open this law, you will not only talk about, let's say, biotech or nanotech, you will suddenly talk about some issues which are much more lucrative to people who have IP. And it will just get actually worse. You start with the idealistic view of greater access, and once the new edition is out, you end up with less. So that's, I don't know, maybe you want to say some more about this issue, but that's a practical consideration. Maybe you should, but maybe it's not such a good idea to do it after all.
The question of things can get worse are certainly true, and when we see, the industry I follow most closely is the pharmaceutical industry, and it always fights for higher intellectual property protections, and then there's a social movement that's fought quite successfully for access, particularly for HIV/AIDS medicines, and not as successfully for other medicines at this point in time. So this is a contest, and it goes back to something that was mentioned earlier, the role of civil society and activists and advocates as a counterbalance both to government and to industry, and how these political and moral and ethical battles are actually fought. But the risk that things can get worse is not a justification not to try to figure out strategic, smart ways to make them better. And I think it is possible in this context to do so.
I just have a point with regard to your point. I know you are involved in many WHO-related activities. Do you think that public-private partnerships could be a good tool for benefit sharing? Because you were talking about access. I would call it benefits sharing. Do you think that building some public-private partnerships in the domain of nanotechnologies could foster such benefits sharing on the basis of your experience in health?
It's a great question, and there's lots of experimentation going on in public-private partnerships, again, often in the medical field, and they're not without problems, because what's defined as private is usually the commercial interest, and often what's excluded really is civil society engagement, patient groups, et cetera. And so, you really have to look at what's underneath, what's motivating, what's included and excluded. So in many of the public-private partnerships, for example, even to the Gates Foundation does a lot of positive work on, developing vaccines and other medicines. They also very strongly protect the intellectual property system. I mean, to some extent, in terms of their impact in the partnership agreements that they work with, they are often one of the voices that activists are fighting against, because they're basically, their whole industry itself is built on intellectual property. So it's a complicated question, I guess.
So I wanted to follow up on Ron's question, which was, can you apply notions of justice to governance structures, or should it be focused on policies? And I guess most civil procedure professors around here would probably say, well, yes, of course, indeed, all things that are called procedural are in fact substantive at heart, and they're outcome determinative, and you really ought to, if you're thinking about fairness, focus on the structure of the decision making and the constitution of the forum. Especially, I think, in contexts of uncertainty and ongoing scientific inquiry, we often end up falling back on case-by-case decision-making that's been postponed. In other words, we'll set up a governance structure now, but the actual substantive policy will be formulated in a specific context, say the siting of a plant, and it won't be as though the pre-existing regulations tell us what the outcome is going to be in front. Now, from what I've seen in the international arena, in those contexts, we see emerging international law falling back on ideas of participation, voice, transparency, let everybody know everything, and then somehow out of our case-by-case decision-making later, the just result will emerge. But we've also heard today that nanotechnology does, in fact, raise especially difficult questions of knowledge, scientific judgment. There are a lot of uncertainties that will be there right down through the permitting process, let us say. So my question is, do you see ideas of participation? Some people here seem to be saying that ideas of participation and voice, democratic decision-making, ought to be enough that they will launch us into the future adequately. A few people seem to be saying, let's have a moratorium until we can really know more and tell people more and make our regulatory judgments up front, and I'm interested in your reaction to that notion.
Okay. So for me, I would just summarize. I do agree with what Professor Bosso said yesterday about the core issue being an issue of democratic governance. And believe that, I'm a public international lawyer, so I also always go back to my public international law tools. But I believe that there is a legal framework which is available and that governments, international organizations, and all stakeholders can and should use when it comes to how do you call that, to the construction of a global partnerships in nanotechnologies. And for me, we have two pillars. It's right to know and right to democratic participation. If we have those two pillars fully taken into account in the process, but not only for nanotechnologies, for all technologies involving environmental or sanitary risks, I think we may progress or go further in having more acceptable and more maybe legitimate regulations. That's what I think.
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to know to what extent deliberation or access by the public to information will really lead automatically to good decisions. I do believe people will agree that knowledge is required for anyone to make good decisions. I'm thinking that one maybe should divide the public into two groups, the broad public and the groups who actually would have the capacity to deal with a lot of complexity, like watchdog groups and certain NGOs. And I believe for the latter, it's particularly important to just have the access, that if you want to know, that you can. And if that becomes impossible, then doubts will be raised by people who have a lot of knowledge, but are part of the public, and that can cause a lot of problems. To engage 5-7 billion people in the future of technology it's not going to happen. But I would say there's a middle way between the two extremes. The reliance on direct democracy in its most extreme form, where all decisions are made by the broad public, and the elitist representation in its most extreme form, where the public is not allowed to know. I would say somewhere in between. We have to shoot. What exactly it should be, I don't know. I don't think the GMO debate has given us the answers. It is not clear that public involvement in genetic modified food debates has actually led to a greater level of trust, greater level of comfort, better decisions. I don't think that has been settled yet. So I don't think we have a lot of knowledge on what exactly works.
There was not enough involvement of the public in the GM debates.
At the beginning, when Monsanto and others launched the plants, there was no debate. But then afterwards, Britain, for example, had a huge public debate on GMOs, and maybe it was the wrong time. But I believe it was sort of quasi-unsuccessful. It was very expensive too.
I think we've exhausted our window here, unfortunately. So we'll be happy to talk to you after Makan makes the final comments for the day. But as far as our panel goes, voila.
That's it.
Thank you again very much for all the speakers and all the other participants who spoke and who contributed to the conference over these past 2 days. Just as a reminder, we will have the recordings posted online in a permanent link, as well as the presentations. I'll send an email out to indicate where that link is going to be situated, and do feel free to forward this to anybody you think might be interested in what we've been doing here for the past 2 days. For the final remarks, before you get to enjoy the rest of this wonderful rainy day, Makan will say a little bit about also publication plans that might come out of this endeavor. So I'll turn it over to him for this.
Thank you, Sonia. Usually in the French tradition, when you do conclusions, it's about giving your own vision of a conference. I won't do it here because I really I don't pretend to be able to do it. But I think we really had one day and a half of very stimulating and very interesting discussions about the global regulation of nanotechnologies. And Sonia and myself, we would like to thank all the participants for their invaluable input in the discussions. So before I present the road ahead, what we would like to do in terms of follow-up to this conference, I just wanted to read two small paragraphs in resolution. Gabi was referring to it this morning in a presentation, Resolution 2.4 of the International Conference on Chemicals Management on Emerging Policy Issues. And with regard to nanotechnologies and manufactured nanomaterials, the conference invites governments and intergovernmental, international and non-governmental organizations, the industry sector, the academic community, and other stakeholders to work together on research in order to maximize synergies and understanding. I think we've been doing that during the last day. And also the conference has recommended that governments and other stakeholders begin or continue public dialogue on nanotechnologies and manufactured nanomaterials and strengthen the capacity for such engagement by providing accessible information and channels of communication. So I think we've been in a very micro level doing this for the last days. And now to proceed with the future, we are thinking about having some publications related to that conference. So Sonia and myself, we are going to publish an article in the International Law Organizations Review that some of you may know here. It is published by Martinus Nijhoff Publishers. It's the leading review right now in the law of international organizations. So we are going to publish a paper on inter-organization cooperation in the field of nanotechnologies, and maybe to show how the nexus of cooperation among international organizations is changing due to these new topics. And this will be a paper that will be published in fall, during fall to this year. So I hope that we'll be able after to send it to our colleagues here. Then the second publication that we will work on is a special issue of the review of European Community and International Environmental Law, RICIEL, which is published by Blackwell Publishers, that you know very well. It is one of the top 3 leading journals in international environmental law. And we are discussing with the editor-in-chief, Hugh Wilkins, to have a special issue on the global regulation of nanotechnologies. And the idea behind that issue would be to have a report of the conference that Sonia and myself will prepare, but also some of the contributions, some of the papers which were presented here by some of you during that conference. So we will be in touch with you with regard to that special issue. Hopefully it will be for spring 2011. So we will be in touch with you once we have the final approval of Hugh Wilkins. For some of you who would be interested in having their papers published in that special issue. And then the big project is a book. We're thinking with Sonia of editing a book which would go beyond the nanotechnologies. It will be something on the international governance of environmental and health risks, because at the end of the day, we can see that there is some sort of common denominator in terms of international regulation or international governance when it comes to new technologies or dangerous substances. So the idea is to have a book which we hope will be finalized for the end of 2011 or beginning of 2012, which will deal with the international regulation and governance of environmental and health risks. And of course there would be some
there will be some case studies. Nanotechnologies will be one of those case studies. So we will once again, of course, solicit some of you here who would be interested to make contributions to that project. So just to say that we will be in touch with you, because we really want to finalize this process that we have started here in Northeastern. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you to Sonia for all the great organization. She's the mastermind behind all that, and really it was a great conference. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to the Dean of the Northeastern University School of Law, the Office of the Provost, the Northeastern School of Engineering. Thank you all very much for your contribution and your support to the success of that conference. And see you soon in the US or in Europe. Thank you. All right.